Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to episode 7 of the Unstressed Exec podcast. I'm Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and your host for this ongoing series in honor of Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. For today's episode, I'm coming at you on the morning of Father's Day, and I could not think of a more appropriate day to talk about this topic. This is the third in our 4-part series, and it centers on a critically important yet often overlooked discussion point. And it's this: what does mental health look like for men of color and those from disenfranchised or marginalized groups? The story changes depending on the skin you're in, the zip code you're born into, and the system that you navigate every single day. Today, we're going to explore the unique mental health struggles of these men, the barriers they face, and most importantly, how we can better support them, whether we are part of the community or coming from outside of it. Men of color are resilient. It's so important to highlight this. They are a very resilient group, particularly when you look at the disadvantages, not only over their lifetime, but across multi-generational lifetimes. They are leaders, providers, protectors, innovators, caregivers. And yet they carry invisible weights that too often go unacknowledged. The conversation around men's mental health is growing, and that's a good thing. But for men from marginalized groups, the discussion is often not enough, because while men face pressure to man up or toughen up and hide their emotions, men of color often face that pressure in addition to racism, discrimination, generational trauma, and even systemic exclusion. And that combination, it's really suffocating. I've worked with Black men carrying unprocessed grief and rage that they've never felt safe enough to speak aloud. And the systemic impacts of policy, racial-based policies that sometimes go back decades, and the impact on them and their families. I've worked with Latino clients who feel the burden of holding their families together while suppressing their own pain. This is particularly heightened by recent events across the country related to immigration and ICE efforts. Regardless of your political and policy views, and I am not getting into politics here, regardless of your views, these events are highly disturbing and traumatic for the men and their families who are experiencing these events because of how disruptive they are in their life. They are really ripping families apart. And if they aren't directly experiencing them, there is this ongoing underlying fear that they may experience these things at their places of worship or at their work or at where they hang out. I've worked with Indigenous men grappling with cultural loss, historical trauma, as well as systemic neglect. Each of these groups and each of these men have mental health experiences that are unique, and that's why today's episode really does matter. Because there's a layered reality of what men of color are facing. So let's unpack some of the unique challenges. The first one I want to highlight is minority stress and daily discrimination. The term minority stress refers to the cumulative toll of discrimination, microaggressions, and social exclusion. It's literally physiological. Chronic exposure to racial stress can elevate cortisol, increase cardiovascular risk, impair sleep, and lead to anxiety, depression, and even substance abuse. The research is very clear on this. Imagine this: you wake up every day knowing you'll be judged. You know you'll be followed in a store. You know you'll be given extra scrutiny. You know you might be passed over for a job, or maybe even pulled over by the police unjustly. And you just know that's part of your natural reality because of how you look in the mirror. And on top of that, you're told to be emotionally stoic. You're told that amidst these experiences, you need to be cool, calm, and collected the entire time. This isn't just stress. It's toxic stress that cumulatively over time really becomes a massive burden, like a massive anvil tied to somebody's leg, preventing them from moving forward. The second category is cultural and generational trauma. And if you follow the news, if you follow social media, there's a lot of talk about this in recent years, but it's a very real thing and backed up by the research. Many Black, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, and indigenous communities carry trauma that's passed down from generation to generation, related to generations of oppression. This trauma often goes unspoken, but it lives in the body. We know that trauma has a physiological home. It also has a cognitive home, an emotional home, but it has a physiological presence as well. It shows up in things like hypervigilance, mistrust, suppressed anger, even shame around vulnerability, especially for men. Psychologist Dr. Joy DeGruy, who coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, explains that historical trauma doesn't just disappear with time, it persists, especially when the systems remain unequal. The third category that men of color and disenfranchised groups experience is barriers to seeking help. Even when men of color want help, that path is often blocked or it's limited. And there's a few reasons for this. The first one is cultural stigma. In many communities, there's a deep stigma around therapy. Seeking mental health care may be seen as a sign of weakness or something that white people do. It's not uncommon for men to say things like, "We don't talk about that stuff. Therapy is for crazy people," or "What happens in this house stays in this house." This is not just a function of cultural oppression, it's also cultural values that come into place. We've known for many years that Asian and Indian families, particularly those that are first generation in the US, have a very strong stigma against seeking mental health. They're not necessarily against mental health per se, but they believe that these problems should be handled within the home or within family members or loved ones. And seeking help outside the home can often be perceived as an indication of shame on the family. These beliefs are rooted in survival. They are rooted in generations of families who couldn't afford to be vulnerable, but today they keep them isolated and they keep men isolated because these are ingrained over time. And they're ingrained from a young age when we see how our uncles and our fathers handled these experiences. They didn't get help. They talked disparagingly about therapy. They talked down or negatively or shamefully about seeking help outside the family. And that has a big impact as that young boy turns into a young man. The next barrier to seeking help is the general mistrust of the mental health system. There's also justified skepticism of mental health institutions in general. From the Tuskegee syphilis study to over-policing of Black communities, many people of color don't feel safe opening up to providers who don't look like them or don't experience their worldview. Or even worse, they just don't listen to them. Only roughly 4% of US psychologists identified as Black. And similarly, low percentages were reported for Latino, Indigenous, and Asian providers. These groups are significantly underrepresented in the therapy provider space. And so it makes it even more difficult to find providers or therapists that we believe can understand our perspectives and our worldview. And that really matters. Representation matters because healing requires trust, and trust requires cultural competence. The third barrier that we see to seeking help is access and affordability. The problem here is that we can't ignore the economics of getting the proper help that people need. Because the reality is that therapy is expensive. Many low-income communities, which disproportionately include men of color, they face geographic deserts with no mental health clinics or providers. And even when insurance is available, the red tape and copays can be a deterrent. So we've talked just now about the barriers of seeking help, cultural stigma, mistrust of the mental health system, access, and affordability. So the next question is, okay, what do we do about it? What does support look like? So let's pivot to that now, because if those are the challenges that I just went through, what does meaningful support look like? So here are 5 pillars to build support for men of color. And this is systemically, individually, across families. If you're a woman who's involved or has a man of color in your life, these are particularly useful for you as you try to navigate helping him destigmatize getting help and then moving towards getting help. The first is cultural competency. This is a little more systemic. Mental health professionals must be trained in cultural humility. This isn't just about race. It's about understanding cultural values, understanding communication styles, family systems, and trauma history, not only at the individual level, but at the generational, familial level. So if you're a provider and you haven't had training in race-based stress or intergenerational trauma, seek it out. When I went through my training as a doctoral psychologist, I went to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. That's where I achieved my doctoral degree. And they were known, and they continue to be known, for their multicultural psychology programming. Whether you had a designated track in that specialty or you had a minor track, which I did, infused in all of the coursework and the training is a deep sense of understanding multicultural psychology and how it plays out and helping people from non-majority backgrounds. So important to have that cultural competency if you are a professional. And that's what I'm speaking to, or that's what I'm speaking to right now. There's also a second category is community-based healing. There are a lot of programs out there that are outstanding. Programs like Black Men Heal, Therapy for Black Men, and BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. These are filling the gaps that traditional therapy has so far, in some ways, kind of not fully been able to fill. And they're filling the gaps by bringing care to the community, often for free or at low cost. These programs reduce stigma by centering culturally relevant healing. And they do it through group therapy, peer circles, barbershop talks, and workshops that speak the language of the community. When I was in my training at the Chicago School, I did 3 years of intensive training in diagnostics and therapy at the Chicago Osteopathic Medical Center. And at the time, this was in the mid-90s, so I'm dating myself here. At the time, it was in Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago. And while there are some really gorgeous large homes in Hyde Park, most of the catchment area was quite poor, and it was mostly minorities, significant numbers of African Americans and Black people living in those areas, with some Latinos. That demographic has shifted over the years, but that was a large part of the catchment area and the demographic that we served. What was so fascinating that as a white heterosexual male, I was not familiar with growing up on the outskirts of Chicago, was this phenomena where someone would come into that clinic and they would be a janitor at the local high school. And they would work hard, and maybe some people respected them, but a lot of, kids are kids and they're rough, right, in high school. And so they would disrespect or joke about the janitor or not really respect his station in life, right? Or his position. He wouldn't be somebody viewed as being wise or a man of respect. I'm not putting down janitors, by the way. That's not where I'm going. But what was fascinating is that janitor would be the pastor at a local church who has 2,000 congregants on Sunday morning listening to every word that he says. He is an absolute pillar of the community, and hundreds of families reach out to him at their biggest moments of need, death, birth, trauma, whatever it may be, right? So the importance of peer groups, the importance of group therapy, barbershop talks, these are so important in cultures of color because these cultures have had so often to find support in ways by themselves, whereas the larger, more minority systems would leave them behind. So it's so important, and it was so amazing to be part of that training experience, because as much as I learned a lot about psychology, I actually learned more about culture, and it opened my eyes. So a third way that support manifests in these or shows up in these communities is creating safe spaces for emotional expression. So whether you're an executive or resilience coach, as I am, or whether you're a psychologist or therapist, as I also am, whether you're an employer or just a friend or a pastor, Create safe spaces where men can speak without judgment. They can speak without fear of being shamed or judged or put down. That might mean inviting conversations in side by side settings, like while driving, walking, playing basketball, working out, going for a run, whatever it may be. Again, barbershop talks, right? It's kind of informal, but there is some there's some superficial stuff going on at one level, but there is some very deep, profound sharing that's going on at another level in many of these side by side talks. And it might mean being the first to share something vulnerable so that you can model to the other man in your presence that it's okay, that this relationship, this space, this moment is an okay one to share things. So the fourth thing to think about in terms of what does support look like for these groups, for men of color, is bridge building or majority and minority allies. How do we build bridges both as a man of color, if you are, but also as a man not of color, right? Maybe the majority group, right? As a white male or as a woman. How do you build bridges going forward? If you're not a person of color, but you want to support those who are, start by listening. It's so simple. Start by listening deeply and openly and reserve judgment. One way I do that, especially, listen, I'm a fast talker. I've got ADHD. I come from a Greek family, a Greek and Irish family. So you can imagine, like, if you didn't talk fast and loud, you weren't heard in the conversation growing up, right? And I'm also from Chicago. So all of that together, right? But what I try to do when I really know I need to listen deeply and I need to shut my mouth, which is not easy for me to do, frankly, I will listen. And when I think somebody's done, I will slowly count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'll do that in my head. I don't do that out loud. I'm just as you're listening to this podcast, think of how awkward it was for me to count to 5 that slowly because it was just dead air. And that actually was real dead air for 5 seconds. How awkward was that, right? That might be awkward in the moment. It's certainly going to be awkward if you're a fast talker and thinker like me. But what it does is it forces the conversation to slow down and pace. And it really conveys to the other person that you're listening and you're engaged. And it upends that tendency for you to jump right in. Because when we jump right in, we tend to think of the next talking point that we want to make instead of really listening to what they have to say. The other thing is don't assume, don't rush to fix a problem, and don't center the conversation around yourself. So rather than doing any of that, think of doing this instead, or saying something like this. I can't fully understand your experience, but I want to support you however I can. Or what would feel most helpful right now for you? Just throw it out there. Throw out the question and see what they say. You'd be amazed how many people have an idea of what would be useful and helpful for them. Allyship isn't performative. It's not virtue signaling. And unfortunately, there's so much of that we see in politics and we see it on social media. True allyship is about listening deeply and seeking understanding well before moving to judgment. And because of that, allyship is really relational. It's about getting to know that other person and understanding them. So we just talked about what does support look like. In quick recap, I talked about cultural competency. I talked about community-based healing. I talked about safe spaces for emotional expression. And lastly, I talked about bridge building by making allies through both majority and minority groups. So I want to move on to another segment that is really about talking about the disenfranchisement of modern men. And this is kind of general for all men, this applies, but it is particularly salient because of all the things I've already mentioned about those additional barriers that men of color encounter. So I want to bring in some insight from Scott Galloway. If you've been listening to the podcast, you've heard me talk a lot about him in recent weeks. He's a New York University professor of economics. He's also author of the book Adrift, among many others. And he talks a lot about the troubling trends with male masculinity, or masculinity, I should say, and men in the US. And while his focus is often on young men broadly, his arguments absolutely apply to men of color who face compounding obstacles, many of which I've already mentioned earlier. So Galloway speaks of the unmooring of young men. It's a generation that feels disconnected from purpose, they're overlooked in education, and they're basically adrift in the labor market. And he warns of the emotional consequence of this problem. Here's a quote from him. Disenfranchised men don't just suffer, they retreat. And when there's no path to healing, some even lash out. The antidote to that is developing a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of recognition, and having good mental health care. Let me say those again. Purpose, belonging, recognition, mental health care. And I think this notion of disenfranchisement and what Galloway calls the retreat is so well captured by the Langston Hughes poem that was first published in 1951. And it's called A Dream Deferred. Here's the poem, if you haven't heard of it. It's powerful. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crusted sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That so captures for me this sense of disenfranchisement and retreat. And he's talking so much back then, of course, about the notion of young Black men and this perception of a dream deferred. But we are seeing a very similar thing across men of all walks of life and backgrounds, especially younger men. That's what a lot of Scott Galloway talks about. But in particular, with the additional barriers that we've been talking about today, we also see that with men of color. It's something really to be mindful of. And we can't afford to ignore it because the cost of disengagement is too high, not just for these men, but for the communities they help hold together. So let me close with this. The mental health of men of color is not a niche issue. It's not a specialized issue. It is a human issue. It's a public health issue. It is even a justice issue. If you're a man of color listening to this, I want you to know that I see you. I appreciate you. I don't understand the full range of things that it must be like. I am a white heterosexual male and I can't get out of that skin, but I can, and it's a call for others who can try to really understand that your pain is real, that your story matters, and perhaps to share the message that help exists, even if it hasn't always felt that way. If you're a leader, an ally, a coach, a colleague, and certainly a woman with a man of color in your life, a brother, a father, a partner, a husband, a son, you don't need to have all the answers. If you're that ally or that supporter, just be present, be curious, perhaps most importantly, be consistent, and be willing to create spaces where men don't have to carry everything alone and they feel it's okay to not do that. Here's your challenge for this week. I'm going to ask you to share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on your own beliefs about masculinity and race. Find a local or national organization supporting men of color. Ask how you can help. There's many ways in which we can contribute and be helpful. And perhaps most importantly, keep the conversation going. Thank you for showing up for this conversation, and thank you for showing up for the men who need it most. In our next and final episode of this series for Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, I'll explore the high cost of silence. What is the negative societal cost of not supporting men? I really hope you join me. This is one you're not going to want to miss. Until then, I'm Dr. George Vergolias, the Unstressed Exec. Thanks for listening. See you next time. And remember, shift happens.